gentlemen, welcome President of the American Council of Engineering Companies, Arizona, Justin Rice.
Good day to you, 2020 Virtual Roads and Streets attendees. This is Justin Rice, President of ACEC Arizona, and we couldn't be happier to see you all here today. So, today's a big day for us because it isn't every day that we get to welcome Mr. Charlie Cook to come and speak with us about all of this crazy election coverage and all the other things that have come along with 2020 that might be politically related. So please allow me to officially introduce Mr. Cook. I will read a short introduction and then we're going to pass it on so we can get going. Charlie Cook is considered one of the nation's leading authorities on U.S. elections and American political trends. He founded the independent, nonpartisan Cook Political Report in 1984, and now with a staff of 6, has become, in the words of the New York Times, a newsletter that both parties regard as authoritative. So if that isn't a big deal, I don't know what is. The late David Broder of the Washington Post, long known as the dean of the Washington Press Corps, called Charlie perhaps the best nonpartisan handicapper of congressional elections, while the Wall Street Journal once called him the Picasso of election analysis. How many of you have gotten reports like that? For over a decade and a half, he has written a weekly column for the National Journal Group. Over the years, Charlie has served as an election night analyst for CBS, CNN, and NBC. Since 1996, he has appeared on NBC News' Election Night Decision Desk in New York. In 2010, Charlie was the co-recipient of the American Political Science Association's prestigious Carrie McWilliams Award for Outstanding Contribution in Our Understanding of Politics. I'd say that's high praise considering what most people's understanding of politics are. In 2013, he was a resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. So he's got the brains and the beauty too. In 2019, he was named co-author of the 2020 edition of the Almanac of American Politics. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Charlie Cook.
Well, I hope to be half as energetic as Justin is. Thank you, Justin, for that very generous introduction. When Al Hunt in the Wall Street Journal referred to me as the Picasso of election analysis, my sister called me and asked me if I was going through my blue period yet. So I had to look it up. I just barely knew who Picasso was, so I'm not a very cultural person. What I'm going to do today is, and I recognize that all of you living in Arizona, you're in one of the handful of ground zeros, both in terms of the 6 key presidential battleground states, but also one of the top U.S. Senate races in the country. So you're probably in the position of overdosing if you haven't already. Let me just capsule where the race seems to be, and then kind of presidential and Senate overall, and then kind of back up and kind of talk about, some things you might want to look for to keep in mind. Obviously, nobody knows what's going to happen. We're talking about human behavior, anticipating human behavior. We're talking about the future, but, there are things that we can kind of figure out or surmise as we look forward. But there's, when people say that this is an election like no other, with the pandemic, that's absolutely true. So, I don't, nobody can say with any certainty what's going on. In the presidential race right now, it looks like about Joe Biden ahead by about 8 points, call it 7 to 9 points. Now, if you're looking at the averages, you could go on, for example, realclearpolitics.com. And let's see, he's the lead for Biden's lead is about 7 points on 538, Nate Silver's thing, 7 points. The Economist magazine, they have a model that's based on basically polling data and past election results and economic data and all this, and they've got it at 7. Some of the other polls, I tend to focus on primarily the live telephone interviewing polls. I'm not really a big fan of the robocalls, for example. And I think most of the people that are doing online polling, most of it's not very good, although there are a few like the Associated Press, NORC, and the Pew Research polls, but most of those are not that great. But so the race is right now, as I said, about 7 to 9 points for Joe Biden. It had been in sort of basically the 4, 5, 6 point range for much of the last year after Biden got in the race back on April 25th of last year. And then we started seeing the president's job approval, and I'll talk about approvals in a second, kind of flutter in April, started seeing his approval rating come down a little bit in May. And then we started seeing the numbers widen out a little bit between Biden and President Trump, with the president kind of bleeding a little bit. A few independents were sort of going from Trump to undecided, and then there were some others that went from undecideds into the Biden column. There was a tiny bit of leakage in terms of Republicans who left over the course of May or course of June, and then kind of went back after the convention. The president did get a little bit of a bounce. It looks like about a point or two. So the race had gone from 4 to 6 to 8 to 10, and then now it's sort of 7, 8, 9. So a tiny bit closer than it was prior to the conventions, but not a whole lot. The fundamentals of the race hadn't changed. Now, when the race was Biden ahead by 4, 5, 6 points, it was clearly a competitive race, but it was clearly a competitive race, but the president was then, Biden was consistently ahead, but the president was within striking distance. And when you went, instead of went from national down into the states, when you did that, you started seeing Biden ahead more than not in most of the key battleground states, but not by a whole lot. But when it widened from that 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 into the 8 to 10 point range, that's where you started seeing some real movement in a lot of the swing states, with a tiny bit of narrowing since then. And when you look at polling, and I'm going to talk more about polls in general in a few minutes, but when you see a variety of polls, one of the things that's useful is, look at the averages. What you want to not do is you don't want to engage in confirmation bias, where you look at the poll, you find the poll that tells you what you'd like to see happen, and that's obviously the most accurate poll. And any poll that tells you anything different, you really don't want to do that. And that's why the averages are handy, whether it's Real Clear Politics or 538. Although I'm not exactly wild about them, because they include some polls that I think are a little on the sketchy side. I focus on the live telephone interviewing polls. But when you see a whole bunch of polls, one thing to do, is look at the average, but also use the Olympic scoring method. Throw out the high one, throw out the low one, so you're kind of likely to get rid of outliers, and then just look at the rest of them. And you'll have probably a better sense of where, give or take a couple points, where the race is. So where we are right now, or where we were in 2016, is President Trump won 30 states, that had a total of 306 electoral votes, and Hillary Clinton won 20 states, plus the District of Columbia, that totaled 232. So President Trump, his 306, he had 36 more than he needed to win the presidency, 36 more electoral votes than he needed. Hillary Clinton was 38 short. But the margin, in politics, Hillary Clinton won, the popular vote by 2.1 percentage points. But we know that, the national popular vote and $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks. The election was effectively won in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And Michigan was a state that Trump won by 0.2 of 1 percentage point. Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, he won by 0.7 of a percentage point. So you had fewer than 78,000 votes out of 14 million cast in those three states, and 137 million nationwide. Where we are right now is Biden seems to be ahead by, a little to a lot in 26 states, plus the District of Columbia, plus the 2nd District of Nebraska. And I should, for those who don't follow this stuff that closely, For 48 states, it's winner in the District of Columbia. It's sort of winner take all. You get all the electoral votes from that state. But in Maine and Nebraska, they split there so that whoever carries the first congressional district in Nebraska gets that one electoral vote. The second district, they get another, third district, and then the at large for the 2 Senate seats they get. So there's one of the 3 Nebraska seats. Nebraska is an extremely Republican state, but it's almost as if every Democrat in the state lives in one district, and Biden is ahead there. So Biden is ahead by a little or a lot in 26 states. It's got a total of 354 electoral votes, but he's not going to get 354. The president right now is ahead, little or a lot, in 24 states with a total of 184 electoral votes. Now, let's say, okay, where are the leads, more serious, more, a little more durable? Right now, in those 3 states, and all of these that I'm talking about right now are states that are in that 30 that President Trump's carried. Joe Biden has a lead of between 4, 5, 6 points, maybe a touch higher in all 3 of those states that basically determined the outcome of the last election: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And with those 3, it would be totals 278 electoral votes. So you could say that Biden is ahead by at least 4 points or more in states with 378 electoral votes, or 278 electoral votes. Now, if you add in Arizona, and I know there's some polling that's sort of all over the map, but if you kind of look, and there was an ABC Washington Post poll that came out this morning that had the president ahead by, I think it was 1 point, 1 or 2 points, depending on registered voters, likely voters. But that poll looked a lot different from all the other polls that have come out in the last couple of weeks, and which suggests maybe it's an outlier. Not all of the polls we've seen in the last couple of weeks in Arizona, not all of them have been great polls, but a couple of them have been pretty good, fairly reliable polls, and they all showed a wider margin for Biden than the Arizona or than the ABC Washington Post poll. It also showed the Senate race in a little bit different place than all the others. So a lot of times that's where sort of the Olympic scoring method comes in, where if you throw out the ones that appear to be outliers on either end, then you're more likely to get closer to the mark. But with Arizona and Nebraska, that would get Biden up to 290 electoral votes and Donald Trump 248. Now, there are 2 more. The 6 battleground states are sort of the Frost Division, as I call it: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then the Sun Belt Division, which is Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. Now, of these 3, Arizona is the one where Biden seems to be doing the best. He's averaging 5-6 point lead in Arizona. Private polling shows pretty much the same thing, but that the other 2 of the 6 battleground states, Florida, North Carolina, they're much, much, much closer than Arizona, much closer than the Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. So that I just say that it's basically even as much as anything else. So then behind those 6, there are 4 more states that President Trump also carried where maybe he's ahead by 2-3 points, maybe he's behind by a point or 2, depending upon which polls coming, but they're all coming in real close. And that's Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, and Texas. Now, if a Republican incumbent president is worried about Georgia and Ohio and Iowa and Texas, that's a sign that things are not going really well. And it's true. And, the odds are probably better than even that the end of the day that Biden will come up short in all of those, or maybe all but one, but they are very close. And there's a tendency in politics that when states start swinging, they tend to kind of break one direction disproportionately. So we're going to be watching those very carefully. In the House of Representatives, real quickly, the House, it looks basically certain to stay in Democratic hands. Democrats had picked up 40 seats and control the House in 2000. 2018, that Republicans had hopes to be able to pick it up this time. But the president's numbers in a lot of these suburban districts, they're just not good. And where he's kind of holding back a lot of Republican congressional candidates, in small town rural areas and some red conservative areas, the president's doing fine and Republicans are doing fine. But in a lot of these suburban districts, particularly with high percentages of college-educated suburban voters, the president is more of a problem, particularly with college-educated white suburban women. That's where he's got a real problem there. So kind of smash all of that together, it looks like the House won't change a whole lot. The U.S. Senate is where we're watching most carefully because there's, at the beginning of the year, frankly, I thought there was only about a 1 in 3 chance that Democrats would get a majority in the Senate, that there was one Democratic seat that for certain was going to go Republican, and Doug Jones in Alabama. But after that, you only had 4 Republican seats that really Democrats had a plausible chance of winning. Arizona and Colorado were always near the top of the list, and then Susan Collins in Maine and Tom Tillis in North Carolina. Now, what's changed since then is that each of these 4 Republican seats that looked vulnerable at the beginning of this year, each one of them looks a lot more vulnerable now than they did back in January, February. But the other thing is there are 3 more Republican seats that now are extremely close. Additional seats, there's an open seat in Kansas where there's some sort of local problems that are affecting things. Joni Ernst in Iowa, and in Georgia, David Perdue. There are actually 2 Senate seats up in Georgia. So kind of smush all this together. And to be honest, I mean, Martha McSally and Cory Gardner in Arizona, Colorado, they're not dead, but it's looking really hard. I mean, those are just the two seats that Republicans feel most are endangered, and I think they're absolutely right. And the question right now, when you look at polling, it's sort of how bad is it? I think some of the really wide numbers are far stream, but I think you could kind of assume that that McSally is about call it high single digits, and I think a little bit of it. Let me just spend a little bit more time on Arizona, just because that's where you are. There are 2 things that seem to be happening in the country in these Senate races, and to presidential to a certain extent. We are seeing some trends where you're seeing white working class, white blue collar people that once were part of the Democratic coalition, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal coalition, leaving the Democratic Party and moving over towards the Republican Party. So, defined as whites with less than a 4-year college degree are moving this way. While meanwhile, you've got a fairly substantial group of white, suburban, college-educated, more women than not, but not exclusively women, that are sort of moving the other way. And where you've seen that change happen the fastest are some of these Sun Belt states, where you have lots of people moving in from other parts of the country that are sort of diluting whatever the natural voting patterns of the state. So Virginia, for example, was a red Republican state, but gradually it became a purple swing state, and now it's becoming a blue state where each of the statewide elected officials, including both senators, are all Democrats now. North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Arizona have all been moving at varying speeds and levels away from Republicans, or actually it should be this way, away from Republicans, becoming more and more competitive. And the question is, how long, does that trend keep going? But a lot of it's people moving in from other parts of the country, and where this dividing line among whites, and absolutely you could find people that voted for Donald Trump and still support him today that were, of all genders and racial makeup, national origins, and you could find double PhDs. But if you're going to say what is his core group, you would say it was those non-college whites. And where that group, those populations are going up, then Republicans are doing pretty well and Democrats are having to work harder. But conversely, where it's more college educated suburban voters moving into previous conservative places, that's where it's changing the most. So you've got these demographic changes that's happening in Colorado as well, where Cory Gardner, the Republican incumbent there, he hadn't done anything wrong. It's just that the state is just shifting faster than, that's worse than Arizona, faster than in Arizona. It's just shifting out from under him. Martha McSally has one additional problem, and that was when she ran for the Senate, when she was in the House and running for the Senate 2 years ago. It's quite normal if you're a primary, if you're a Democrat, you might need to run to the left to nail down your party's nomination, but then it's really important to pivot back and move back towards the middle where the swing voters are, where the voters are between the two 40-yard lines, And on the Republican side, sometimes if you've got a tough primary, you got to move to the right, nail down the nomination, and then make the pivot and go pivot back over. But for Martha McSally, for then Congresswoman McSally, she made the pivot over. You remember she had Joe Arpaio and Kelly Ward were real conservative in the race. She had to move way over right. But once she won the nomination, she just somehow didn't make the pivot back towards the center and just sort of kept going. And it reminded me in a perverse way of the movie Forrest Gump, where, Forrest Gump is playing football for the University of Alabama to Bear Bryant, and he gets the football and he keeps running, runs through the end zone and keeps running out of the stadium. That McSally basically kept going right and took, here you had this relatively centrist member of Congress who was running as an ideologue, while you had a fairly liberal Democratic Congresswoman who was running as a centrist. And that Sinema effectively got to the center while McSally, who started off in the center, moved over out of position and simply has not been able to kind of get back over where swing voters are, where she does fine with the conservative base. Absolutely no problem, but it's swing voters because the base isn't big enough. So that's what we're seeing. So right now, I think there's a better than 50-50 chance that the Senate is going to flip. It's going to be close. There are going to be a bunch of really close races, and you could see 50, 100,000 votes total separating, between which party is going to be in the majority, which party is going to be in the minority. But it looks right now more likely than not that the Senate's going to flip. Now, let's focus more on the presidential for a couple minutes. There's a temptation, the old saying about generals fighting the last war, where in politics, a lot of times people they wage the last campaign. And they tend to look at an election, a campaign, through the lens of the way things were in the last election, whether those same dynamics are applicable or not. And that's why I think this election here, you have a lot of people that are looking at the 2020 election, but they're sort of superimposing the conditions and circumstances and players that were there in 2016. As best I could tell, and I'll elaborate on this more in a second, but there are probably only like three things that are in common, really, between the 2016 presidential election and 2020. One is they're both obviously U.S. presidential elections. Second, Donald Trump is the Republican nominee in both of them. And three, both years begin in a 2. But other than that, are really not the same at all. And part of it has to do with the fact that when you have an election that is between two candidates and neither one of them is an incumbent, that is a choice election where people are choosing between two candidates. And certainly partisanship comes into play because we know that 90% of the people that consider themselves Republicans are going to vote Republican down the line, and 90% of the people that consider themselves Democrats are going to vote Democrat down the line. And of the 40-something percent in the middle that call themselves independents, the vast majority of them really aren't independent, because the vast majority of them will profess, if you push them, that they lean one way or the other. And basically 80% of the independents who will admit that they lean Republican really vote Republican. And same thing for 80% of the independents who lean Democrat go that way. So you're really only left with somewhere between 5 and 13% of the vote that is honest to gosh independent, purely in the middle, no tilt whatsoever. So that, but when you have an incumbent president run for reelection, it's a completely different set of dynamics than in a choice election. Choice, I should have used the example, George W. Bush, Al Gore in 2000, 2008, Barack Obama, John McCain, 2016, Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump. But when an incumbent's running, like in 2012, when it was Barack Obama, Mitt Romney, or 2004, George W. Bush, John Kerry, or 1996, Bill Clinton, Bob Dole. When you have an incumbent running, it's a referendum on that incumbent. 75, 80% of the equation is referendum on that. Do people want to renew that president's contract for another 4 years? Yes or no? Thumbs up, thumbs down. And that record, the incumbent has a record that they have to defend. Now, if you're an endangered incumbent, and let's face it, back in 2012, Barack Obama was an endangered incumbent because the economy, it was better than it was in 2008, but not that much better. And that was a race that was still, when we went into the summer of 2012, that race was still very, very, very competitive. And it was not clear at all that Obama would go on to win by 3 percentage points in the end. But the thing is that that Obama had a record he had to defend. But when you're an endangered incumbent and it's on the line, or your things have not gone as well as you would have liked during your term, then you try to do two different things. And you try to disqualify your opponent by trying to basically politically disfigure them, make them so attractive, an unacceptable alternative. And you remember Obama and the Democratic National Committee attacking Mitt Romney on Bain Capital and private equity and all things like that, where most of the decision was going to be a referendum on Obama, but they tried to do what they could there. Or you try to change the subject. Make the election about something else. If you don't want it to be up or down on your record, you try to change the venue of the election. But 75, 80% of it is a question of is a referendum on the incumbent president. And what we found is that the best predictor of whether an incumbent president is going to get reelected, quite simply, is their job approval rating. Is when you ask in a poll, do you approve or disapprove of the job President whoever is doing? And one of the things we found is that in the post-World War II era, every president that had a job approval rating above 50%, every one of them won. Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon, Dwight Eisenhower, everybody at 50 above won. And the three that were below 48 all lost. Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush for the electeds, Gerald Ford for the appointed. And the one that I left out, you may have noticed, was George W. Bush. Now, he had his last Gallup job approval ratings were 48, 49. So he was just a bit shy of that 50. And you remember on election day 2004, that was a really close race. And there were parts during the day when, people were thinking, well, it looked like maybe John Kerry won all that, where 48, 49 is that's really, really, really close to the edge and probably can go either way. And in that case, it did go George W. Bush's way. But so where does President Trump stand? And I'll talk a little bit about relying on polls in a second. I probably should have done that a minute ago, but let me just go ahead and finish this train of thought. In his first, for historic numbers, we always use Gallup because they're the only ones that have been asking polling since the end of World War II. So for the entire year of first year in office, so January 20th of 2017, when President Trump took office, all the way to January 19th of 2018, for his first year in office, he averaged a 38% job approval rating, 38%. Now, that was the lowest first year of any elected incumbent in post-World War II history. 38%, the lowest. Now, if you're curious, who was the second lowest? It was Bill Clinton. But Bill Clinton had a 49% job approval rating for his first year in office, and President Trump's was 38. So what about the second year, effectively 2019 or 2018? President Trump's approval rating for the year average went up 2 points to 40%. And it was the lowest second year in office of any elected president in post-World War II history. So, that's not real great either. Then you go to this third year in office, 2019, last year. His numbers, approval for the year, went up by 2 more points to 42. So we went 38, 40, 42. And it wasn't the lowest of any third-year elected president post-World War II history. It wasn't the lowest, but it was the second to the lowest because Jimmy Carter's had slid down below President Trump's 42 and had gone down to 37. But we know what happened to him. And that George H.W. Bush was actually a little bit better, and he ended up losing too. So that where the president's been, his last 2 Gallups have been at 42, one was at 41. If you look at average of all the major national polls, and some of these are polls that I'm not really crazy about, but it's a couple points higher, but it's not at is not at the kind of place where you say this person is even an even money bet for reelection. It is south of that point. And that President Trump, his numbers have never kind of fit the pattern of other presidents. Normally, when you're first elected, you get what they call a honeymoon. You get a period where you're just you haven't had a chance to do anything wrong. And people want, a lot of people, there are partisans out there, but a lot of people they want the country to do well, and they're willing to give a new president the benefit of the doubt. And take George W. Bush, for example. Now, Al Gore won won the popular vote. Now, truth be known, it was only like about a half a percentage point, about 500,000 votes, but technically he did win the popular vote. But the thing about it is, there's a little bit of that, and it was contested in Florida and winning Florida by 537 votes and going all the way to Supreme Court and a 5-4 decision, all that. So it's not the greatest circumstances to take over the presidency, but you know what George W. Bush's first Gallup job approval rating was after taking office, about a week or 10 days in? 57%. Where clearly there were people that didn't vote for him, people that voted against him, who were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. And when you look at the Gallup polling, what was interesting is that President George W. Bush was in office 1,205 days before his disapproval rating in the Gallup poll ever hit 50%, 1,205 days. His dad was in office 1,136 days before his disapproval hit 50. Jimmy Carter, 849 days. Now, when they dropped, they really dropped, but 849 days. Ronald Reagan, 690 days. Barack Obama, 572 days. Bill Clinton, 150 days. But for President Trump, his disapproval hit 50 only 8 days into office, where it's like people had opinions of him that were really, really strong from the very, very beginning, and they just got there pretty quickly. And if you just sort of look, most recent Fox News poll, disapproval, approved 48, disapproved 51. Now that's Fox. NBC Wall Street Journal, 45 approved, 53 disapproved. Quinnipiac, actually, they've got a poll coming out this hour, but I haven't seen the new numbers. They came out at the top of the hour. 43 approved, 54 disapproved. Gallup was 42.56, CNN 42.57, Monmouth University 41.53. So that it's definitely underwater, and it got there real quickly. And if President Trump were a stock, you would say he's got a very narrow trading range, because he's never hit 50 in any of the major national polls. He's never been above 49% was his highest Gallup job approval rating. 48% was his highest Fox News poll. It was 47% in the NBC Wall Street Journal, 45% is highest in CNN, and 44% in both the ABC Washington Post and the PBS NPR Marist poll. So a very narrow trading range. Now think about this for a second. You had, when things go really well for him, his numbers still don't hit 50. But when things go really badly for him, they don't drop below a certain point either. And take, for example, last year. From September of last year through February of this year, we had 6 consecutive months of 50-year low unemployment. And yet his approval rating hardly went up at all and never did touch 50%. Wow. And when, briefly it looked like there was going to be a peace deal with North Korea, his numbers didn't jump up. And think about when the coronavirus first hit, the approval ratings for world leaders around the world, most of them went way up. Most governors went way up initially, but President Trump's didn't. But when things go badly, his numbers don't drop much either. For example, a story comes out, his lawyer paid a porn star $130,000 in hush money. His numbers didn't move. When the Woodward book came out, I knew his numbers weren't going to move. Whether he did or didn't, I wasn't there. I don't know whether he said, losers and suckers for military casualties. But the thing is, I knew that it wasn't going to hurt, because the thing is, his base, about 42%, they are going to be with him no matter what. They are as loyal as like rock solid. But there's 45-50% on the other end that are just as adamant against him. And then there's these folks that are in the middle, but his numbers just don't move much. And there are 2 different reasons for that. 3 reasons for it. One is the partisanship that we have in this country. He averages a 90% job approval rating among Republicans, and that number just doesn't move up or down much. Over on the other side, he averages a single digit. The last Gallup, I think, was either 4 or 5% approval rating among Democrats, but it's usually single digits, occasionally hit 10 or 11, but it's usually single digits. And the only variance is among independents, and he's generally in the 30s there, mid to high 30s. And so any fluctuation comes from them. But when you've got a little over 60% or about 60% of the electorate that's either, 90, 95 for you or 90, 95 against you, that keeps your numbers from moving. And I would, when bad things would happen for the president, and then some of my liberal Democratic friends would say, well, the president, Trump's numbers, they're going to drop now, don't you? And I'd say, well, no, because the thing is, to drop, you generally have to go up to drop. And because his numbers never went up much, he can't drop a whole lot. He's right within that trading range, and waiting for someone to drop. This is like, under these circumstances, it's like waiting for your pre-shrunk jeans to shrink. They're not going to shrink. And they sort of are what they are. They are what they are. Let me talk for a second about polling. I probably should have done this earlier on, because I have a lot of people that will say, why should we listen to polls? That the polls were all wrong. The polls told us that we were that Hillary Clinton was going to be president and all that. So why should we listen to polls at all? Well, the thing about it is, it's not quite as simple as all of that. Because when you look at sort of what actually happened in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the national popular vote, as I said a little while ago, by a 2.1 percentage point margin. She basically won at 48 for Clinton, 46 for Trump, the popular vote. Now, what was the average national poll? Was Clinton ahead by 3.2 percentage points. So 47 to 44. So the national polls were off. They both pointed the same direction, and they were off by 1.1 percentage points, where Clinton got 1 point above what the average showed, and Trump got 2 points above what the average showed. But that's pretty close. Now, even though, and I'm going to talk about state polls in a second, but when pollsters and political scientists went back to look and say, okay, 1.1, it's not a whole lot, but why were they off that much? What happened that also might apply in some of the state polling? And what they found, this is not a shy Trump voter. It's not a group of people, any sizable group of people who were going to vote for Donald Trump but didn't want to admit it for whatever reason. It wasn't that. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody like that, but it wasn't like that at all, because in fact, you saw this disparity. You actually saw it in places where President Trump was wildly popular. You know, if you live in Idaho or North Dakota or someplace that's incredibly Republican, why would you be shy about admitting that you're going to vote for President Trump, for Donald Trump, when all your neighbors, you know, most of your neighbors are too? But what they found was that it wasn't people lying or not answering. What they found was in the sample that was taken, there was a slight but real undersampling of whites with less than a four-year college degree, and a slight oversampling, overrepresentation of whites with a four-year college degree. Now, as I said a couple minutes ago, all kinds of people voted for Donald Trump 4 years ago, are going to vote for him this time and support him, all that. And you can find people with double PhDs that voted for him. But if you're going to say what was his core demographic were whites with less than a four-year college degree. And any poll that has any systemic underrepresentation of them is going to come in a little low for him. And because he encounters more resistance among whites with college degree than Republicans usually did, than a Mitt Romney or a John McCain or George W. Bush or H.W. Bush or whatever, and more than a lot of other Republicans right now, then that will make him underperform as well. So knowing that, in 2018, the pollsters started weighting their numbers among whites by educational attainment, and bingo, it worked like a charm. And people say, well, but a lot of people have cell phones. 70% of the samples in most of these national polls, 70% of the calls they're doing is to people with cell phones. So they're doing that. So the national polls were off a little bit. They found out why, they fixed it, and in 2018 worked like a charm. And to be honest, the Republican pollsters I know, I talk to all the time, they don't believe this shy Trump thing. I mean, there's somebody like that somewhere, but not many. Now, if you look at the states, basically 40, if you woke up on election day in 2016 and you looked at the Cook Political Report and you said, okay, where are their ratings? What do they say? When they look at state polls, both public and private, when they're doing all this and pulling all this together and assessing where each of the 50 states are, where do they put it? We put 45 states as lean, likely, or solid Republican that did in fact go for Donald Trump. We had them rated as lean, likely, solid Democrat, and they went for Hillary Clinton. We had two states that we had rated as toss-ups, Florida and North Carolina. And Florida, that's just a perennial. Obama in 2012 won Florida by 1 percentage point. And the governor's race, Trump won it by 1 point. The governor's race, Senate race was 1 point in the last election. So that we knew that. And then we had 3 states where the polls were just flat wrong, way wrong. And in those 3 states, there were states that had disproportionately more whites with less than a 4-year college degree. There were states with the most restrictive late voting in terms of early voting, early vote by mail, absentee voting. So they had very high percentages of election day vote, and the exit polls were quite clear that the late breakers, people that decided in the last few days, last week, broke overwhelmingly towards Trump. And that we also know that of the people that had an unfavorable view of both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and Trump had the highest unfavorables of any Republican nominee in the history of polling, and as did Clinton, the highest unfavorables of any Democrat, that there was a quarter of the vote that disliked both, that had unfavorable views of both, but they broke for Trump by a 19-point margin. And finally, places with industrial areas, high industrial things, they tended to do well for Trump. So that sort of explained what happened in those 3 states. But for the most part, the polls we're looking at are actually quite good. But where people misread it is they assumed, well, the Electoral College, the popular vote, they go the same way. Well, the thing is, you're right. I mean, in 1876 and 1888, the popular and the electoral vote went the opposite way. Then for 104 years, they all went the same way, no matter how close the race was, 1948, 1960, whatever. They both went the same direction until 2000. But while Gore won a greater popular vote, it was only a half a percentage point, 500,000 votes nationwide. It wasn't much. It looked like a statistical fluke. And it wasn't apparent until election night, 2016, that the Republican vote had become so much more efficiently allocated around the country, with Hillary Clinton winning California by a 4.3 million vote margin, winning New York State by 1.7 million, winning Illinois by 945,000. And so Democrats were wasting a lot of votes. So bottom line is where we are right now. Could things change in this race? Let me just finish up with this. Could things change? Of course they could change. What were the things, and we've got, you can say we got 41 days to go before the election. Well, we have 41 days to go before November 30th. But when you consider that the first mail-out ballots went out week before last, that early voting started in the first states last week, with and signs that more people are planning to vote earlier, and there are more applications for vote by mail for early voting than ever before, that every day goes by, you've got people that are voting. The first debate is coming up a week from last night, next Tuesday night. You're going to have a substantial amount of the vote will have been cast before the first debate even occurs. So bottom line is that, yes, there's time for things to change, but the coronavirus didn't get corralled as quickly as the president obviously wanted and they hoped. They didn't get the 5-point bounce out of the convention they hoped they'd get. They got about a 1 or 2. They're hoping they get a bounce from the debate, even though they're not really debates. But, and the first one is going to be with Chris Wallace as the moderator. And, well, the interview that the president had with Chris Wallace about 2 months ago didn't go well, if you saw that on Fox News Sunday. So things could change, but I'm a little skeptical. And in the last sentence, if I had to, put the odds out, I'd say there's a 20% chance that President Trump wins the Electoral College. And built into that 20% is all the uncertainty and what ifs and black swan events and all that. I think there's a 40% chance that it's a skinny Biden win, that Biden wins the Electoral College, but by maybe just Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, maybe Arizona too, because I think he is going to win Arizona. And maybe that's it. That would be a skinny Biden. And a big Biden is if he starts winning, say North Carolina, Florida, or any of those, Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, Texas, any of those. That's where it starts rolling up. And I frankly don't think it's going to get there. So that's how the election looks right now. Things could change, absolutely. But keep in mind that the president's numbers aren't very volatile. He's not terribly resilient. And with good things happen, his numbers don't pop up. And so I'm a little skeptical that he can close this 8-point gap that he has right now. I think you're on mute, Justin.
Ready to go.
There you go. There you go.
So I am astounded because I can't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning. And your level of knowledge is just incredible to me. And I'm sure it is to our audience as well. So thank you so much.
Nobody would want to live in anything that I engineered or surveyed, I assure you. So,
we all have our talents, don't we?
We all have our talents. Some people have more than others. And my guess is your members have a heck of a lot of talent.
They're pretty talented. So, Charlie, I've got a couple of questions for you. Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
Perfect. So one of the big questions that a lot of people are asking is with regard to the passing of Justice Ginsburg on Friday. How do you feel that will impact the Supreme Court nomination, the election, the Senate? Oh my gosh, so much.
That's a great question. The Kavanaugh nomination 2 years ago had a very significant effect on the outcome of that election, but it had different effects on different people. And I called it a color enhancement event because it kind of made the blues bluer and the reds redder. and it just intensified emotions that were out there. But the thing about it is, Democrats were already at DEFCON 1. Since the 2016 election, they were already so energized. My late mother used to use an expression, somebody was madder than a wet hen. Well, Democrats have been madder than wet hens ever since November 2016. Republicans weren't that energized in the summer of 2018, but that Kavanaugh nomination, it basically put some steel in their spines. Republican energy levels went way, way, way up. And so in the end, in the states where red Republican leaning states, which is where most of the Senate races were, Republicans did, and the president was really popular. Republicans did really, really well, but it was in those states with big, fast growing suburbs. That's where Republicans got really, really hurt, losing a 40-seat majority in the House, losing control of the House, and all those suburban districts outside of Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Kansas City, Oklahoma City, Richmond, Virginia, places like that. So now this is one, though, where I think both parties' bases, frankly, were already incredibly motivated. And when you've got a base that's already incredibly motivated, there's not a lot of room between them and the ceiling. And it will raise up a lot of money for Democrats, but quite frankly, there's a law of diminishing returns on spending. And all you probably have to do is watch television in Arizona, say, nobody's going to lose in Arizona because of a lack of money. But where it could make a difference, I think, we're in some of these Senate races, but it could work for Republicans in some places and for Democrats in others. If you're a Democrat in a very close Senate race, but it's a red-leaning state. So if you're the Democratic governor of Montana, Steve Bullock, running against the Republican incumbent in Montana, and Bullock, the Democrat, needs Trump Bullock voters. Well, this Supreme Court fight's not going to help him. Lindsey Graham is in a tough race in South Carolina. The Democrats, Jamie Harrison. President Trump's going to carry South Carolina easily. Jamie Harrison needs Trump-Harrison voters. This Supreme Court nomination is going to make that harder on, that Democrat. The Kansas open seat, that will make it harder for Democrats in that race. But I'd say less true in Arizona maybe, but in Colorado with Cory Gardner and Susan Collins in Maine, they needed this like a hole in their heads. I mean, because both of them were trying to walk this tightrope between the two sides and not alienate. How do you choose between your party's base over here and swing voters that are between the two 40-yard lines over here? McSally hasn't tried as much to walk that line. So, I'm not sure I'd put it quite in that category. But so I think in the Senate it'll have different effects, but probably, in the end, it probably cancels each other out. But this is Justice Ginsburg's passing. It's enormously consequential. But just in terms of the election really is going to be more about President Trump, and it's not going to be about Ruth Bader Ginsburg or the vacancy or Amy Coney Barrett or anything like that.
Thank you, Charlie. Based on the demographics of our audience, I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question on their behalf. Can you elaborate on both candidates' position or plans for infrastructure improvements? Are they similar or very different?
Well, I'm not, I don't get in the weeds on specific policy proposals, but I've watched Joe Biden, for 48 years. I mean, I came to Washington a couple months before he did as a freshman in college and working on Capitol Hill. I think, first of all, I think any Democrat coming in would put infrastructure as a major priority. And I know your members are going to find this shocking, but Democrats like to spend money. They really do. I mean, you're not asking Democrats to perform an unnatural act here. And that Obama would be a little bit less of an infrastructure type person than most other Democrats, because he wasn't a bricks and mortar concrete kind of guy. But I think Biden is a lot more. But I think with where the economy is right now, I think anybody that gets elected is going to have to do some serious infrastructure next year. I mean, I think it's inevitable. For number one, our infrastructure is falling apart. We built a whole lot in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and guess what? It's going bad, as your members know better than anybody else on the planet. And number two, the kind of jobs that infrastructure spending creates. It is, the ability of a working class, and I'm not talking about your members, I'm talking about people that like do the construction underneath what your people are surveying and designing as things. The percentage of good jobs for folks like that because of manufacturing has gone down, 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 down. And we've got to do some serious job creation for, middle class, working class folks, and folks that are not necessarily tuned for the knowledge economy. And so for economic infrastructure reasons, economic reasons, civil stability reasons, this is something that's really, really, really important. So I think you're going to see a big infrastructure spending. Now, obviously, look, our budget, our national debt next year is scheduled it looks like it's going to equal our entire GDP. Okay, that's going to be the pushback. But the thing about it is, we're not going to be able, we got to get to the point where we could pay down the deficit someday, but we got to get the economy getting back going in order to be able to do that. So I think absolutely believe that we're going to see a ton of infrastructure. We'll see a big infrastructure bill. And it's just going to be, the fight will not be over spending. The fight's going to be who pays for it, how do you pay for it? Gasoline tax, how do you pay for it? Or do you just suck it up and use the pandemic and the recession as an excuse to say, okay, look, we're not looking for the pay fors. We just got to do it. Just do it. And it may end up being like that.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That was really insightful. I know that's very valuable information for our audience here today. So it looks like we might have just about 2 minutes for a quick question, if that's okay with you.
I'll try to do a quick answer.
Thank you.
Your questions aren't long. My answers are long, so that's a problem.
No, unfortunately, we have a hard stop, so that's why I wanted to keep going. How do you feel, and this is a big question, but how do you feel COVID-19 will affect the elections?
I think this is the biggest crisis our country's faced in 3/4 of a century. And I think that a lot of other Republican presidents, if they were sitting there, probably, I think a Mitt Romney, a John McCain, a George W. Bush, a George H.W. Bush, a Ronald Reagan, I think they probably would have reacted a little faster, to be perfectly frank. And that when you look at the president's job approval rating on handling the coronavirus, basically about 40% approve, which is basically his base, and 60% either disapprove or not really sure, but you're getting like 49, 50% strongly disapprove. But the other thing, it's not just handling or reacting slowly or whatever, but it's almost more a little philosophical, because when you ask people in a poll, which do you think is more important? Getting the economy back, reviving the economy, getting it back going again while we're fighting the coronavirus? Or do you think it's more important to get the coronavirus under control, and that has to happen before the economy can be revived? It's not quite 2-to-1, but it's in the direction of 2-to-1. People say you got to get it under control and do what it takes to get under control. Then we could get the economy back going. But the president, it's like the opposite of the approach. So it's how quickly did he acknowledge, react? Has he handled it well? There's all of that, but there's also the approach question. But also the other thing is that the most compelling argument to reelect President Trump was the economy was so strong. That was his tailwind. That was helping him so much. The loss of that tailwind it's not a headwind in his face, but it's the loss of the tailwind. That makes it harder. So this has not helped him. But the thing is, when you're a president, before I ever heard the word coronavirus, his job approval still ain't cracked 50. So he was going to have a tough race no matter what. I think it just made a tough race tougher.
Thank you so much for answering that question, Charlie. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I know everyone has a ton of questions, but really, really, really appreciate everything that you shared with us today.
Well, and if you guys want to send me some questions for me to do, I'll type answer offline, and I'll send them back to you, and you can distribute it to your members if you'd like. But I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you so much. It will definitely take you up on that offer. So very quickly, thank you everyone for joining us today for day 2 of the 2020 virtual conference on roads and streets. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
Take care.